have to say one of my favorite TV shows out there has gotta be Dan Vs. For those who don't know about this show, let me give you an idea of the premise. The show's about an angry sociopath named Dan who can go off on a hair trigger and dedicates the entire episode to getting revenge on whatever he feels has wronged him. And it's a show that managed to air on the same network as My Little Pony somehow. But if I'm being real here, this show is awesome and it's one of the funniest TV shows I've ever seen. It's essentially what you'd get if you had a show that had the satirical wit of South Park and a main character similar to that of Invader Zim. I've been wanting to make a video about this show for a while, and now I finally am. So with all that exposition out of the way, this is my top 15 favorite episodes of Dan Vs. Starting off the list, we've got Dan vs. Art. Basically, the premise is Dan is not happy after someone turns his car into a work of art. I mean, in this episode, Dan ends up trying to destroy stuff at a local art festival until he eventually then tries to destroy stuff in a big art museum. Meanwhile, Chris is along for the ride to try to help Dan get revenge, but mostly to try to understand art himself. One thing I love about this episode is how it pokes fun at all the pretentious art snobs who try to find hidden meanings in everything.
This piece is clearly a metaphor for man's love of cupcakes.
It's not a metaphor! It's a car!
Nowhere is this more apparent than in the part of the episode where Dan and Chris go and vandalize Art Artstein's exhibit before it opens, but when it does open, the fact that they vandalized it ended up making it a hit. And towards the end of the episode, it gets revealed that Art Artstein simply uses a slot machine to decide what he'll do next. In other words, there is no meaning. The episode's not completely against art though, especially towards the end. It stresses that art can be great so long as you don't get all pretentious about it. Also, interestingly enough, in this episode we find out in a pretty hilarious way that Mr. Mumbles is actually a female cat.
What do you mean she?
Girl cat.
Wait, in what context did you discover that?
We're wasting time.
Here's a simple but hilarious premise for an episode. Have Dan, Chris, and Elise go and rob a bank. Elise needs the money to stop a dangerous bioweapon from being unleashed on the world, and she can't get it otherwise because of bureaucratic gridlock. And Dan feels the need to get revenge on the bank because...
What is this? It was one thing when it was $2, but this is crossing the line! Give me back my money!
It doesn't start off with that plan though. At first, Dan tries to steal one of the pens, but ends up getting arrested for indecent exposure because he didn't realize that the pens were chained down. I think the funniest part of the episode has to be how Dan makes Chris dress up like a clown for the robbery because Chris didn't want to rob the bank. As you would imagine, this leads to a lot of hilarious jokes.
One false move and the clown gets it! I just want to go home!
Kind of a monster threatens a clown. All they do is make people happy.
And at the end of the episode, Elise gets her money, Dan gets his 50 cents from a gumball machine, and the bank burns down. Which is incredibly ironic when you consider just how many places Dan's burned down, and for once, he actually had nothing to do with it.
Strange, I don't remember doing that.
I think for once, the fire isn't your fault. Directly, anyway.
An awesome end to an awesome episode. I think it's safe to say that some shows do superhero parodies better than others, and I think that Dan vs. the Superhero really hit all the right notes. After a careless superhero drops a safe on top of Dan's car, Dan's out for revenge. Dan's initial plan is to give Terrific-Guy some competition by having him and Chris dress up as superheroes and fight crime. As you would imagine, this plan didn't end well. After being humiliated by Terrific-Guy again, Dan feels it's time to change up his strategy. Dan decides to become a supervillain, and we get to see some of the attempts of him trying to give himself and Chris superpowers.
Are you trying to We need superpowers! It's either this, or I inject you with a super serum I got on the internet.
However, Chris manages to convince Dan that he doesn't need superpowers to be a good supervillain. Dan agrees, gets some gadgets, and then goes and successfully holds a fireworks factory hostage. One thing I like about this episode is that just through Dan's planning, he's able to strip Terrific-Guy of his powers at the end. Also, is it just me, or does this matchup make anyone else think of Batman vs. Superman? We just got done talking about an episode about a superhero, now let's talk about an episode about a dinosaur. You know, Dan vs. really isn't the kind of show where you would expect to have a good action-heavy episode, but Dan vs. the Dinosaur is pretty good. Let me just say, this episode has a lot going for it. First off, we got a lot of character from Ben in this episode. In Dan vs. the Family Thanksgiving, Ben really just came off as an angsty teenager. However, he actually grows as a person in this episode after he starts to feel bad about how he screwed up royally at the museum. Not to mention, I really like this Australian hunter guy that helps Dan, Chris, and Ben hunt the dinosaur. I think he's pretty funny. Meanwhile, there's a running gag with Elise in a bunch of different disguises, trying to convince the public that there was no dinosaur. Probably the best part of the episode is the ending scene where the Australian guy turns on Dan, Ben comes through in the end, and Dan decides that he can't kill the dinosaur because it reminds him too much of himself. Also, it just goes to show just how funny this show can be when they can make a funny joke about one of the main characters supposedly getting killed.
So, I guess we won't have Chris's body for his funeral.
We won't have what?
I promise, years from now, we'll all look back on this and laugh. Well, not Chris. He's dead.
Of course they didn't actually kill him off though. I mean, could you imagine how much the show would go downhill if they cut Chris out of the equation entirely?
Baseball!
You know, Dan vs. Baseball really is a great introductory episode to anyone who's new to the series. It's got a little bit of everything. Dan getting mad at something and wanting revenge, Elise doing secret agent stuff that conveniently ties into Dan and Chris's plot. Not to mention, this episode introduced my favorite running gag in the series.
How can you stand to be tear-gassed? My eyes are watering just sitting next to you. I've been tear-gassed so many times I don't even notice anymore.
This episode has a lot of funny setups, whether it be Dan and Chris getting fake bootleg tickets, Dan completely misunderstanding what a bat boy is, and Dan being an umpire despite not knowing the rules of baseball. Eventually though, Dan's able to kidnap the commissioner of baseball and stuffs him in a hot dog cart. Kinda funny, Dan tries to torture the commissioner of baseball, but the commissioner turns out to be a pretty nice guy, willing to reimburse Dan for his mirror, and promising never to preempt population control Johnny again. Dan vs. anger management. Come on, we all knew it had to happen at some point. After trying to destroy the world in order to kill a family of squirrels, Dan gets sentenced to anger management. They explain it in the show, but I might as well explain it here. The reason that Dan didn't get sent to somewhere like Guantanamo is because the US government didn't want the people to know how close they were to nuclear annihilation. So Dan's there for pretty obvious reasons, but Chris is also there because apparently he's not angry enough. As you would imagine, a lot of hilarious scenarios come out of this premise, particularly the point where Dan gets so angry that he causes all the other anger management patients to go into a fit of uncontrolled rage. But this episode really gets on here because it's the ultimate role reversal episode. You see, after Dan notices his anger management counselor gets really angry at littering, Dan manages to convince her to turn over to his ways of revenge. However, this ends up backfiring on Dan, as once his anger management instructor got the first taste of revenge, there was no going back for her, and then she starts trying to blackmail Dan into helping her out with her revenge schemes. Obviously, this makes Dan angry. So angry it sends him into his lowest point and actually causes him to read the anger management book, which actually works and makes him calm. However, Dan's calm and passive attitude towards the fact that he's getting blackmailed and extorted gets Chris really angry. So Chris litters all over the elementary school, which causes the instructor to snap and try to kill Chris. And the anger management patients are the ones that get the instructor to calm down at the end. Sheesh, that's like 5 role reversals in one episode! Oh, and Dan goes back to being a maniac at the end of the episode. Let's face it, we all knew it was going to happen and we wouldn't have it any other way.
Vegetable! Oh, yes, gross!
Remember earlier in the episode where I compared this show to South Park? Well, the reason I bring it up here is because this is the episode that most reminds me of South Park. I don't know, I guess the way they portray vegans in this episode just sounds like something South Park would do. Trust me, this episode is not kind to vegans.
We would rather go hungry than sacrifice what we believe in.
There you have it. One man's insane plan to starve to death for no reason.
Although to be fair, it's not like the episode claims that Dan completely avoiding vegetables is a healthy lifestyle choice or anything. But anyway, let's get to the premise of the episode. Dan's mad because at BurgerFile they're switching out french fries for vegetables. Dan initially tries to combat this problem by giving free burgers out to everyone at Vegan Vic's market. And Chris gets incredibly distraught when Vegan Vic throws a bunch of the burgers out into the street.
I can't believe he just threw burgers in the street! He's a monster!
I know I've been showing a lot of clips here, but I think my favorite part of the episode has to be when Dan discovers vegetables in Chris's fridge.
How much of our food did you destroy?
It's not food! I opened my first mate's refrigerator and it's jam-packed with the enemy! You, sir, are a veggie sympathizer!
Basically, Dan steals Elise's military ID, uses it to get his hands on a chemical defoilant known as Agent Kiwi, and then uses that to destroy all the vegetables in the area. This causes all the vegans to have nothing to eat, which gives context to the clip I showed earlier. Elise manages to get her hands on the truck, but Dan manages to get his hands on one of her machines, which he uses to create a giant broccoli monster, by accident. After a bit of a fight with it, the monster ends up getting devoured by all the vegans. A hilarious end to a hilarious episode.
Magician!
Dan versus the Magician. Should I say this is a truly magical episode? Nah, I probably shouldn't. That was too bad of a pun. The plot of this is very simple. A magician humiliates Dan and steals from Chris, and they go to get revenge on him. This episode has some pretty interesting things to it, like Elise apparently having a fear of magicians. But the episode really starts to get good when they go into the Magic Manor. The Magic Manor is a really interesting location, and a lot of entertaining things happen once Dan and Chris get there. Whether it be Dan sicking Mr. Mumbles on a flock of doves, Dan and Chris going through a series of dungeon puzzles, and the reveal of Elise's hilariously tragic history with Magnifico and why she's scared of magicians. Also, it's hilarious what happens when Dan discovers Magnifico's room full of stolen goods.
And for your information, I found all these watches, and I bought all this jewelry. I don't care about that. Steal away! I just want you to admit that you don't have any magical powers.
And it all culminates in an epic magic duel between Dan and Magnifico, where Dan explains every single one of Magnifico's tricks to the audience. There is something strange about this episode, though. I know they joke about how Dan wasn't able to explain how Magnifico got his hands on Dan's underwear, but there's one thing they never actually acknowledge in this episode. If levitation was done with fishing line and pulleys, then how was the security guard able to levitate outside? I don't know, maybe he's a relative of Terrifigai or something. Boy, is this a breath of fresh air. I'm sick and tired of how so many shows nowadays, whenever they do a technology moral, they try to say that technology's bad and it's turning us all into antisocial zombies. This episode essentially says, hey, if you try to avoid technology entirely, you're just as bad. Not only does this episode have a unique moral regarding technology, but it also serves as a really good parody of Apple. Basically, Dan got a brand new computer, and after just a couple days, it broke down and he went in to get it fixed, but that model was already outdated so they wouldn't repair it. I also like how this episode kinda shows both the past and the future. The future being Barry Didmer's complex, which admittedly has some pretty cool imagery in it, and the past being Hiram's cabin in the woods. Speaking of which, Hiram is a really funny character. The climax of this episode's pretty cool too. After Elise learns that Barry Didmer's gonna try to mind control everyone, Barry ends up mind controlling her. And at the end, Dan manages to take down both Barry and Hiram using Hiram's own anger against him. Overall, this is a really good episode. If you're wondering why it's not higher, it's because I don't think this episode is as funny as some of the other episodes. Although I will admit, Hiram's bits were pretty dang funny. You know, in a lot of episodes of this show, you probably won't agree with Dan on what he hates, but here, I think pretty much everyone can agree that traffic sucks. Dan tries several tactics to try to remedy this problem, each one getting more and more ridiculous as the episode goes on.
What are you doing? I'm closing all the exits on the 101. Soon, this road will be mine.
And this is what happens at the beginning of the episode. I mean, later on, he blows up an entire car dealership. What's interesting about this episode is that, aside from the beginning, this episode takes place largely from Chris's point of view, which really makes Dan feel like a supervillain when he unveils his plan to give the entire town vertigo so they can't drive. I mean, in a lot of episodes, I think it's really hard to argue that Dan's a good guy, but in this one especially, he just feels like a supervillain. Interestingly enough, this is one of the few episodes of the series where Dan actually fails. He doesn't just get karma for what he did, he actually fails to do what he set out to do. Typically, that leaves an episode kind of feeling lacking, but due to the changed perspective in this one, I think it actually works. Maybe it would have worked out for him if he got his hands on that monster truck.
What seems to be the problem?
You know, in a lot of episodes of Dan Versus, it kind of feels like an adventure with the characters going to a bunch of different places. However, this episode manages to be good with having Dan confined to one location for almost the entire episode. Basically, the manager of BurgerFile got Dan's order wrong, and he was too full of himself to either fix it or give Dan a refund. Dan's plan here is very simple. All he does is he chains himself to the cash register until he gets his refund. Basically, throughout the whole episode, it's Dan and the manager making moves against each other, but it's clear throughout the entire thing that Dan has the upper hand. It starts off simple. Dan, being at the cash register, simply convinces the customers not to order food by spreading lies about what they put in the food at BurgerFile. Manager tries to retaliate by calling the police, but they prove to be pretty much useless. Plus, Dan points out the ridiculousness of the situation. What are they going to do, lock him up? The manager then pulls out the big guns and tells everyone in the restaurant not to give Dan food in an attempt to starve him out. To which Dan replies,
Do you know how long it takes to starve to death? Or the effect that having a chained up corpse at your counter will have on business?
You'll give up before you die.
You clearly don't know who you're missing.
Then things really start to escalate when the news media gets involved, people start protesting in Dan's honor, and that eventually leads the CEO, Jeremiah Berger, to come down and sort things out. He's obviously disgusted by what the manager's done, but they get into a fight and it causes a grease fire, which was cleverly foreshadowed by Dan's ramblings at the beginning of the episode. However, instead of putting it out, Dan and the manager just fight over it until Jeremiah Berger wakes up and puts out the fire himself. And yes, all of that happened within one episode that took place only in a fast food restaurant. Okay, there was that one scene where Dan and Chris picked up the chains, but literally everything else that happened in the episode happened at BurgerFile. I didn't even mention the fact that Dan actually kind of had a love interest in this episode. Obviously the episode had to break him up by the end, but it did it in a pretty satisfying way. That is, if you pretend Dan versus the wedding doesn't exist. Overall, this is a fantastic episode that is definitely worthy of being... Wait, it's only number 5 on the list. We still have 4 more to go.
Summer camp! Please don't leave me here!
Who knew that Dan vs. would be the type of show to have an origin story? But it does, and Dan vs. Summer Camp is a pretty good origin story. Not only that, but it was also the last episode of the show. The episode mainly takes place in the form of flashbacks, with the occasional jump to the present that usually provides a good joke or two. The episode basically chronicles the events of how Dan and Chris met and how Dan became as revenge hungry as he is. Dan is essentially forced to go to a summer camp called Camp Atrocious that is led by the camp counselor Mr. Tedesco. Basically, what's so bad about Camp Atrocious is that all the older kids are allowed to pick on the younger kids and pretty much do whatever horrible things they want to them. And I know what you're thinking, is this one of those stories where the bullies just hide from the counselors and get away with everything? No, this behavior is not only allowed, but at times even encouraged by Mr. Tedesco. Dan tries to mount a resistance against this, but it results in all the kids getting tied up and missing breakfast. After several failed attempts, all the kids abandon Dan with the exception of Chris, who still sticks by him. By the way, even this early in life, Chris still ate way too much.
Those leaves look good. That's poison ivy. Oh. I'm gonna eat it anyway.
Yeah, even as kids, Dan and Chris still have the same dynamic that makes them funny as adults. Thanks to clever planning, Dan and Chris are finally able to get their hands on the Spirit Stick. However, Mr. Tedesco is not amused.
Mr. Tedesco decided to invent a new group activity called Civil War Prison Camp.
Yeah, it's not hard to see that a complete psychopath like Tedesco would drive Dan down the path of revenge that later engulfed his entire life. But Dan and Chris managed to escape and pick off the warriors one by one. It's especially satisfying when you see just how far Dan's gone with this plan.
Running to the police to solve your problems for you? Sounds like you need some toughening up.
They take down Tedesco, and the episode actually ends on a pretty sweet note to end the series on. Overall, this was a really good episode that was technically both the beginning and the end of the series.
Fancy Restaurant!
How's this for an episode concept? A fancy restaurant ends up replacing Dan's favorite sandwich shop, and I don't think I need to tell you what his goal is, it's kind of obvious. And Chris and Elise both end up going there for their anniversary. I love how Dan gets himself, Chris, and Elise into the restaurant. He pretends to be valet parker, knocks out a family of 3, stuffs them in the trunk of their own car, and then drives back up to the restaurant pretending to be them. There are a couple segments of Chris and Elise eating dinner, and while they're relatively pointless, they're also pretty funny and poke fun at a lot of aspects of fine dining. Dan impersonates the chef and sabotages the specials, but it ends up getting him thrown into the dungeon. Yeah, it's a dungeon for all the chefs that screw up and are forced to do all the hard work and don't get paid at all. With the help of Chris and Elise, Dan stages an entire revolution that actually feels pretty epic. The poor all rising up in a revolution to take down the rich. Where have I seen this before?
Yeah, it's like the American Revolution. If it happened in France.
Overall, this episode was great. It had great jokes, funny satire, and an overall epic feeling to it. Hey, have any of you guys out there ever seen the movie Idiocracy? I bring this up because this episode is very reminiscent of it. Basically, Dan notices that people in general are just getting dumber, whether it be things like the driving curriculum no longer teaching the passing lane, speed eating competitions becoming popular, and of course...
They made another Humongobots movie?
Of course they did. The first 5 are huge hits.
But they're awful!
Dang, they weren't even trying to be subtle with that one, were they? Dan's goal in this episode is very simple, to stop people from getting even dumber. There's also a nice side plot with Chris preparing to enter a big speed eating contest in order to impress Elise. And yes, Dan does point out how ridiculous that is.
So your plan is to prove yourself worthy of Elise by eating huge amounts of fatty foods as quickly as you can, even though Elise is dead set against it?
Their journey ends up taking them to the governor, who seems almost encouraging of the stupidity. Dan and Chris infiltrate the governor's office and find out that all of this is due to a big government conspiracy led by the EU to make America dumber. Dan and Chris make fools of themselves in front of the governor, and the governor decides that the mission is over, America's gotten dumb enough. Like I said before, this episode feels very reminiscent of Idiocracy, and it parodies a lot of things in culture that make it seem like everyone's getting dumber. Although, I don't really believe that. I believe there have always been idiots, and we're just putting more focus on them now. Which I guess is a way society's getting dumber then. Oh well, philosophy aside, this is still a great episode. The amount of things they make fun of truly outclasses just about any other episode of the series. The only question is, what could beat it?
Elisa's
Now I bet you guys are wondering, how does this episode beat Burger File, Summer Camp, The Fancy Restaurant, and Stupidity? Well, here's how. You see, I think a lot of the best humor in Dan Vs. comes from the hilarious interactions between the characters. And this episode really has the most funny and memorable reactions from the entire show, at least in my opinion. The premise of this episode, like a lot of them, is very simple. Elisa's parents come into town. Elisa's parents are mean to Chris, have never been happy with Elise no matter what she accomplished, and Dan wants them out of the way so he can go to the Renaissance Fair. Dan finds a way around Elisa's rules pretty early on and tries to convince the police that Elisa's parents are in the Mafia. But rather than having that be just the first of many attempts, it just keeps escalating from there. Dan hands the police a hilariously tampered with tape recording as evidence.
What about the local crime syndicate? I'm going to permanently cupcake them.
Cupcake is the new mafia word for kill.
They buy it and send in a cross-dressing undercover cop to pose as Dan's date. But the undercover cop's actually working for the Mafia and is going to have Don killed. And Dan steps in to warn them and save the day. And all throughout the way, there are a ton of hilarious interactions and moments that are thrown in. I mean, I didn't even mention the part that after Elise's parents announce that they're moving there permanently, Elise starts having a mental breakdown and starts acting like Dan. Overall, this episode was great. It was the funniest episode of the series, had some good heartfelt moments in there, and had a pretty good story while managing to deviate from the series' usual formula. Which is saying something, seeing as most of the best episodes of the series stick to the formula. So that was the list. I really hope you enjoyed it. Dan Vs. really is one of my favorite TV shows of all time, and I really recommend you check it out any way you can. I'm not saying this in hopes that it'll bring the series back and get it renewed for a 4th season, because I know that's probably not going to happen. I just wanted to share the awesomeness of this great TV show with all you guys. So with all that said, I'm Defoffilizer, and I'll see you in the next video.